Thank you for joining us for this Bookseller webinar on women's voices in Arabic literature, supported by the Sheikh Zayed Book Award. I'm Marcia Lynx Qualey, editor of Arabic Quarterly magazine and co-organizer, along with Sawad Hussain, of the Bila Hudud Literary Festival. This year, the Sheikh Zayed Book Award in literature went to one of my favorite reads of 2020, Iman Mersal's In the Footsteps of Iman Mersel. The book, as it searches for this forgotten novelist, opens up many aspects of women's lives in mid-20th century Egypt and beyond, in the realms of mental health care, marriage and motherhood, women's relationships to the law, to work, to the literary world. It raises questions of how women's writing in Arabic fit or didn't fit into male-dominated literary spheres. And these are some of the topics we'll talk about today with our three brilliant panelists, who are Iman Mersal, a renowned Egyptian poet, writer, academic, and translator. She works as an associate professor of Arabic literature and Middle Eastern studies at the University of Alberta, Canada, and currently resides in Marseille, France. She currently holds the Albert Camus Chair at IMERA, the Institute for Advanced Study in Marseille. An anthology of her works was translated into more than 20 languages, and she has 5 poetry collections published. Her work, In the Footsteps of Iman Mersel, was published in 2019 and won the Sheikh Zayed Book Award for Literature in 2021. Dr. Marle Hammond is currently Senior Lecturer in Arabic Popular Literature and Culture at SOAS University in London, where she teaches courses on Arabic literature and Middle Eastern and North African cinema. Previously, she was a British Academy postdoctoral fellow and a St. John's College Research Centre fellow at Oxford University. Her books include Beyond Elegy, Classical Arabic Women's Poetry in Context, and The Tale of Al-Bara, Son of Rawhan and Layla the Chaste, a bilingual edition and study, both published by Oxford University Press for the British Academy Monographs series. And finally, Sawad Hussain, who's an Arabic translator and literateur who's passionate about bringing narratives from the African continent to wider audiences. She was co-editor of the Arabic-English portion of the award-winning Oxford Arabic Dictionary, and her translations have been recognized by English Pen, the Anglo-Omani Society, and Palestine Book Awards, among others. She's run workshops introducing translation to students and adults under the auspices of Shadow Heroes, Africa Writes, and Shidbek Festival. She has forthcoming translations coming from Fitzcarraldo, Maclehose, and Daedalus Books. She holds an MA in Modern Arabic Literature from SOAS, and her Twitter handle is @Sawad Hussain. Welcome to everybody who's here in the audience today. We are so delighted you could take time out of your day for this event. And I'd like to start with Iman on the question of 20th century women writers like Iman Mersel and their relationship to authors today. Is it important for authors writing now to know about the work of earlier women writers? Should more women's writing from the 20th century be included in the canon, however we want to construct that?
So, hello everybody first. I understand your question, Marcia, as if it's a question about the canon of Arabic literature.
Yes.
And I think it's a good idea to start with a definition of literary canon. I mean, we agree that it's a measuring device to classify and to evaluate literature. And if we remember this definition, maybe we can't add or erase anything from any literary canon. Otherwise, we will try to be a police that is fighting with other, different police trying to do the same thing. It's a good idea to think about, for example, Western literary canon, which was considered the highest and the most influential canon in the globe. Mm-hmm. And since the 80s, lots of voices are criticizing this canon, asking questions: is it inclusive enough as it should be, or why does it underrepresent women or minorities, or even third world literature from colonies, writers writing in English or French, for example, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to Arabic literature, I don't think it's important to add or erase anybody. it's more important to maybe revisit it and question it. And in order to do this, we have to agree on some keywords, to examine when we talk about Arabic literature canon. For example, ideology. This canon was not created from the very beginning. Even our reading now of classical Arabic literature went through the creation of the Nahda discourses about identity and literature. Gender. It's not important for me really if women are underrepresented or not. It bugs me to see how female writers are read in our culture. This is even more important. Do we add female writers to the canon because they are tackling feminist issues, despite the fact that the text they are writing is good or bad, for example? We have to think about genuine literature more than issues that are discussed or the content of this literature. Technology is playing an important role. In the classical time, and Marlé can talk about this much better than me, there was ijazah, which is permission for books to be copied and recopied and added to the court library and so on and so forth. Now with technology, the production of books are enormous, and there is economy around the books. There are awards, there are media, social media. There are also images of writers that are in play. Each writer is trying to make himself, stick to, his own image or make a fake image or whatever. And there is also actually the most important thing of all is style. Literature is excluded sometimes because of its style and language, not because of political issues. And actually, we tend to overrate writing that faced censorship because of our solidarity with it, without questioning its, questioning it as a writing. We also tend to, get to know some writing that was not known because of censorship. And censorship here is, authoritarian censorship, top down, but it's also social censorship down to top, if we can describe it this way. So to sum this, I think we inherit the literary canon, and we have to revisit it, question it. Each generation or movement has to ask questions about it. And also, some people are doing this. It's not just Inayat Zayed book that is trying to push this, boundaries a little bit. I'll remind, and all of you, I'm sure, know these two books. Samah Slim book, The Popular Fiction. And it's a fascinating book. It's actually rereading the popular fiction in the turn of the 20th century and telling us about so many writings that were excluded or pushed away because the question of identity was centered during the Nahda time. And the ambiguity of translation, the act of translation in late 19th century, early 20th century played role in not really including so many beautiful writing. So if we go back and read this book, this is actually a challenge to Arabic literature canon. Zina Halabi, for example, is challenging the same canon, but from different perspective. Her book on the unmaking of Arab intellectuals, when she questions the image or the theme of prophecy in Arabic literature, modern Arabic literature, she is questioning actually all of the big figures, usually male, usually famous, usually huge, Adonis, Mahmoud Darwish, I can name so many. When you question the theme of prophecy, you are revisiting the canon of Arabic literature as well.
So I know I promised to move on to somebody else after this first question, but I'm just going to follow up a little bit. So when, for instance, Sania Saleh is not included in the canon,
yes,
is this because of her style? Because because she herself allowed herself to be in the shadow of her husband's writing, or how does that happen?
Oh, this is a whole story. I mean, the theme of prophecy in Arabic literature played a role. Adonis is a prophet. Muhammad al-Maghut, her husband, is a prophet, but she is not. Women, likely in Arabic poetry, in modern Arabic poetry, can't be prophets. And this is really what is enhancing their poetry today, making them the best producers of Arabic poetry at the moment. But also there is a personal issue, the self-awareness, the mare of the family, being a wife of Muhammad of al-Maghut, or sister of Khalda Saeed, the sister-in-law of Adonis. And here own fragility and low self-esteem and slight depression as well. So when you focus on any individual, you might find so many layers that were playing roles. Some of them are, about the canon, but some of them are also personal.
So Marlé, if I can shift to you now. I was wondering about because you've also written about elegy, for instance, which was a form that was long associated with women writers in Arabic. I was wondering in which ways medieval Arab women's writing continues to influence 20th and 21st century forms of women's writing in Arabic. And I also, there's this new collection that I think you consulted on. We wrote in Symbols about women's writing about sex from the medieval period to now. And it was the medieval women's writing that inspired Salma to put the collection together. And of course, Malaika and her change in use of elegy. And I wondered if you could speak to that relationship longer ago than the 20th century. And don't forget to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
You're
still unmuted.
Sorry.
You told me not to mute myself, so I wouldn't do that, and I did anyway. I was just saying that it seems to me, and perhaps Iman has ideas about this, but it seems to me that the influence of, whether you want to call it medieval or classical or pre-modern Arab women's writing, that the influence on contemporary women's writing is rather indirect, and that there's not, for the most part, a whole lot of imitation, except when you find, for example, someone like Fadwatul Khan, the poet Fadwatul Khan, mourning her brother Ibrahim, right? So then she composes elegies, and people have compared those elegies to those of Al-Khansa. So Terry DeYoung has a chapter about this. So I think, and when it comes to women's erotic verse or women's poetry that is not, so I mean, the reason why everyone associates women with elegies is because Al-Khansa and to some extent Layla al-Akhyaliya were canonized. So the poetry that wasn't canonized, right? Like I think it inspires women more than it influences them. And this is because there are just so many. So if you scratch beneath the surface and you go looking for these non-canonical authors, you just find so many of them, and that's very inspiring. And the idea that there are so many women's voices to be rediscovered is empowering. But the way that they're circulated, these women's verses, they're circulated almost as novelties. And so they're sort of in a continuous state of rediscovery rather than of canonization when you're talking about the pre-modern women poets. Interesting.
And is that different in the academy versus in popular reception?
Okay, so is this going on to the next question about the academy? So you mentioned the academy before, and I don't know if you're talking about the Arabic Academy or the English Language Academy. Do you
However you want to answer the question.
I mean, what I wanted to say about the Academy is that I think for the most part, when pre-modern women's poetry circulates, this isn't always the case, but it's often the case that it circulates without any critical apparatus. And it's often the case that, for example, there are a couple of bilingual anthologies of Arabic women's verse, and in those anthologies you find folk figures and imaginary characters alongside what are presumably actual poets. So I think for me, the role of the Academy, one of the roles of the Academy is to distinguish between, like today's webinar is called Female Voices in Arabic Literature. So are female voices the voices of female authors, or are female voices the voices also of female characters? Because of course you have a lot of folk literature in the Arabic tradition, and there are female characters in this folk literature who utter statements in verse. And sometimes we don't discern necessarily between historical personae and folkloric or even imaginary personae, which I think I kind of feel like we need to do it. And it's a problem also with men's poetry, because the poetry was transmitted orally. So the earliest Arabic poetry would be from the 5th century, and then it was transmitted orally until the 9th or 10th century, when in the era of codification. So of course there's also a lot of men's poetry, which maybe wasn't authored by men. We don't know for sure who authored it.
Right. Yeah. And then this, whether or not it has a story with it also matters, right? Like Al-Khansa, there's not just her poetry, but there's also what we know about her and her personal story. Does that?
Right. And in the early 20th century, Sawad Hussain wrote an essay. It was in a periodical. It was published. I can't remember which one. I can't remember the year exactly, but it was called Hayat al-Khansa. And I think it was addressed to Mai Ziyada. And he was sort of arguing that we have to be careful, like we can't necessarily believe that these women poets that we're celebrating actually were poets, because we don't know what sort of imaginary folkloric and what sort of historical and folkloric. But a pet peeve of mine is that the women of the Audrey love tales, so there are these love tales in Arabic where often you find two young people, cousins, falling in love. They're the same age. They fall madly in love, and the male will become a poet and compose all this love poetry for the beloved, the female. And then she's married off to someone else, so that the love is never consummated, and he dies of love sickness, and then often she'll utter some elegiac verses and then die of love sickness also. And so you have a number of these Audrey love tales where the beloveds speak, and they speak in verse. And so sometimes these Audrey beloveds appear in anthologies of women's verse. And I think it would be nice if we made more of an effort. It's not that we shouldn't necessarily exclude the voices of women when we have questions about the historicity, but that we should discuss the relative historicity of individual poets, when they become topics of conversation.
And all these male poets from the 6th century oral poets could have been actually women writing. Well, not all.
Yes, in theory. Well, with collectively authored literature, then you, of course, with collectively authored literature, women have an input, but what is that input and how can it be measured? We don't know.
Yeah.
So I will turn to Sawad. Hello, Sawad. And I wanted to talk about women's writing and discoverability, because I know that you, as a translator of contemporary Arabic literature, are always on the lookout for new, great writing by women writers and by all writers, particularly
Specifically women, yes.
Specifically women. And specifically from the African continent. So you have, speaking of the African continent, you have actually 3 great works forthcoming that I know of, probably more. Jamila Morani from Algeria, a YA novel by her, Najwa bin Shikwen, Libyan writer, a short story collection, and one of my favorite writers, Stella Gaetano from South Sudan. And while Najwa bin Shikwen is fairly well known, she was shortlisted for the International Prize for Arabic Fiction. The other 2, not as much. So how do you find out about new women writers and what they're writing? And do you find discovering work by women writing in Arabic is more challenging?
So firstly, in terms of how I discovered, I think I'll just take you through how I found out about each of those books just as examples, because they're all very different. So, for example, for Jamila's book, I found out about it because Nadia, and I'm forgetting her last name. Hanem, thank you, wrote a review about it for Arablit blog. And then I found people in the Arablit community very generous with their time and context. So, I reached out to her on Twitter and I said, I love this review. Do you have the author's contact? I'd love to, speak with her, get a copy of the book. And it just went from there. And then I got the book and then I read it and then I loved it. And so I was I need to pitch it. For Najwa bin Shatwan's work, I've been stalking her for a while. I had wanted to translate the Slave Yards, but I think if you remember, we had done a co-translated sample, which unfortunately wasn't successful, with her agent at the time. And so I was still just reading a lot of her work. And then I came across her short story collections and I had reached out to her. I got her contact off of her previous agent. And we've become, friends since. I've been, working with her for I think about maybe 2.5 years now or so. And I'm still pitching another of her short story collections. So that was quite organic. And then for Stella Gaetano, again, I think I had seen a review of her short story collection. Is it Withered Flowers?
Withered Flowers, yes. Withered
Flowers, yeah. Which again was on Arablit blog. And so then I kind of Googled around her and I think I got her contact. I'm trying to remember. I don't remember from who. But all I'm saying is genuinely my experience with women writers is they've been so warm and welcoming and everyone's very happy to have a conversation with me. But usually in terms of me keeping my finger on the pulse of what's, coming out, because the oldest thing I've translated is Sahar Khalifa's Bab as-Saha, which was, I think, written in 1980, I want to say 5. Everything else I've translated is after that. There's a really rich culture of booktubers in Arabic. So on YouTube, there's these amazing people who just spend so much time reviewing books on YouTube. And if you subscribe to some of their channels, they're really, I find them very helpful. So I must thank them. I mean, there's too many to name, but truly. And then also just recommendations from authors. I had collated a list for you, actually, I think 2 years ago for Women in Translation Month. And I had to contact a bunch of different authors for that, asking them for, which titles do they think should be in translation? And just from conversations with them, what sort of books do they like? And these are men and women recommending women's books to be translated, not just women recommending. And so from there, I also got Bushra al-Maqtari's book, which is Khalf al-Shams, Behind the Sun, that I just got the English Pen Prize for. And I'm also working on her nonfiction, which is called Mada Tarakta Warak, What Did You Leave Behind, which are war accounts told by 43 different people of their loss from the war in Yemen. So all of that's just kind of, I think you have to be really, I'm just keeping an eye on the time. Sorry, you have to be very motivated, I guess, and not scared for people to say no. I have contacted authors who have said no, like, you know, earlier in my career, or even today, they're like, we don't think you're big enough. Like, you don't have a big enough profile. Like, we want to work with a big translator. You know, we want to work with Marilyn Booth. And I was like, okay, that's great. So, well, thanks for letting me know. And I was, you know, like, that's it. And then your second question was, is it difficult to find women's writing? And I would say no, because I think I've built up like different like places I'll go, certain websites I'll read, or blogs or YouTube. I mean, I think if you're just starting out, yes, because I did like I've mentioned this before, like it's not a quantitative study, but it's more like a subjective one, where I collated a list of all the different sort of interviews online and on like different TV channels with women writers, right? So ranging from places like Sudan to the Emirates to Egypt, like different broadcasting networks. And honestly, it was just like a third of the literary guests which were on those shows were women. And and it's not because there's not women writers out there, it's just they're not getting the airtime, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that's answered your question. Yeah.
Yes, I did. I wanted you to talk about that perception of yours, that there aren't as many interviews of, so
yeah, or even
you
print.
don't see women writers out there talking about their work as much as you see men writers out there talking about their work.
Yes.
So Iman, if I can come back to you. I wanted to talk about back to Sania Saleh and that essay that you wrote, or it was published in 2015. At one point you say that you weren't brave enough to say that Al-Malaika and Fadwa Tuqan and Salma Jayusi were important poets. And I wanted to know what you meant by that, and how your assessment changed, and what that has to do with canon, if there's a personal canon as well.
All right. Let me explain why did I say this first. So this article was about Sania Saleh searching for her book in Cairo and not being able to find it. And also the story that I didn't learn about Sania Saleh when I was, in much need to read here as a young poet, myself searching for a modern female Arab poet to identify with. So all I learned was about Nazak al-Malaika, Salma al-Khadra al-Yushi, Fadwa Tuqan, and alike. And the question why Sania Saleh was not presented, in the 90s, for example, to us. So maybe, of course, Salma al-Khadra al-Yushi, Fadwa Tuqan, Nazak al-Malaika are important poets, and they will remain important. I just wanted to distinguish between different types of importance in a literature. They are great poets to be studied and to tell us about, female writers, development in 20th century. But it's not the kind of poetry that I go to read in the night before I go to sleep when you are, battling insomnia. And to tell you the truth, I read them midday in my desk for a reason. And this doesn't make them less important or anything. I'm just expressing my relation with them. While with some other female poets, at least for me, the story is different. I mean, when I read Sania Saleh, I go to get Sania Saleh a particular poem and read it. I'm in need to read this poem. It enlightens something inside me. I can understand something about, my own darkness when I read her. She can share her thoughts about death, motherhood, loneliness with me, and in a beautiful language that I can relate to as well. Not just Sania Saleh. I mean, I think our problem is when I wrote a book about Inayat Zayed became cult. When Wagih Ghali is translated, he became a cult. I mean, it's crazy. This kind of work is done to really make us think again about this canon of Arabic literature and to trust our readings, what we like and what we don't like, and not to add or to erase from the literary canon, as I said, but to encourage the diversity. to ask, you know, who put this text here? I can't, I don't enjoy it, for example, and why, and so on and so forth. So back to our female poets, it's not Samia Saleh only. I will give examples of Dada Haddad, for example. Actually, a few months ago, I have been an admirer of Siham Jabbar, and she is an Iraqi poet for so many years. I don't know her, and I don't know anything about her, but I think she is one of the most remarkable voices in modern Arabic poetry. And she is not present at all. Why? I don't know. Maybe, I mean, exile, maybe people who left Iraq can play the exile card very well, being victims, being voices or representative of Iraqis, but this woman doesn't do any of that. Maybe this is the reason, I don't know. But I read one of her poetry books recently, and it's called, I think, قديما مثل هيباتشا, or as old as Hibatia. And I loved the poems. I wish to see these poems read widely in Arabic world and translated even to different languages. So this is my selectivity. And I have to push the boundaries to bring this selectivity to readership. That's all.
Okay, I want to follow up on one thing that you said earlier, because I think I can't remember if I heard the same thing from Yasser Abdelatif or Janan Haji, but that women's Arabic poetry right now is where the action is at.
Yes.
And that's like across countries. And why is that?
I actually have a long, discussion, dialogue between me and Yasser about this issue. And we come up with different reasons, but maybe it needs really to be studied. I mean, so far, Yasser might talk about, masculinity and femininity. Like, I mean, women, old female poets in the 40s and 50s used to borrow the masculine voice to talk about nation or about Palestine, or I think since the 90s, female Arab poets don't have to do this at all. First, the prophecy is defeated. First thing, the masculinity is defeated. But it doesn't mean that this will make a woman a good poet just because she is not a prophet or masculine. There are so many other things that we need, I mean, I don't know even what is it. For me, actually, I think we are impacted by fellow writers, male writers who are writing now, and they are writing about like broken masculinity, which I don't like either. So maybe women are free of this relatively. Maybe they are marginalized more. They have more opportunity to think and to write.
Right, because marginalization offers some space of freedom, right? To think and do things more experimental. Right. So Marlé, if I can pivot back to you. So unmute now, okay. So in the way that Iman talks about looking for women writers who she could relate to, who were writing about some of these topics, do you think that if we, is there some space to rediscover medieval women's writing, classical women's writing, in order to build on that, or why is it important to look back and find those voices?
Okay, well, I think that the way I kind of look at it is that, Arabic is this amazing language which has this long history of literature, and it subsumes many cultures. We tend to think of it as one culture, but it's not one culture, it's many cultures. And I think that, since the inception of Arabic literature, there have all along been women who were writing alongside men. And sometimes these women, made different choices when they were writing than their male counterparts would have. So I think that it's, I think that we have a lot to learn from the pre-modern women writers whose works we still don't know. I think there's too much of a focus sometimes on elegy and al-khansa and that kind of voice. And then, you also have kind of a body erotic voice coming through sometimes, but women wrote all kinds, they wrote in all genres. And I don't know, I have a list here of some of the women who are quite famous, and now I've lost it. So one of my favorite poets is Nazhoun, who's a 12th century Andalusi poet, and she has some invective, some hijab, that's quite entertaining, and then she has a muwashaha, which is a stanzaic, a strophic love song, and as far as I know, her muwashaha is the only muwashaha ascribed to a woman. And I think that when we find, bits and pieces of women's literary history that seem to us as being exceptional, we should ask ourselves, well, were they really exceptional? Is this the only muwashaha that was composed by a woman, or were women more involved generally in composing muwashahat? So I'm not sure if I answered your question exactly.
As long as it's interesting, it doesn't matter if it pertains to the question at all.
Yeah. You were going to ask me about, the genres and forms that are composed, or that women are associated with now. So if in the pre-modern era, we associate women primarily with elegy, what do we associate with them now? And there I just wanted to say two things. One, I think that there is no one. I think that women aren't really pigeonholed anymore, and that, women are contributing to all kinds of forms and genres. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And then the other thing I wanted to say, and maybe we could relate this to what Iman was saying before, is that, and she was talking about how women's poetry right now is sort of where it's at and where things are really happening, because I think that women are often at the forefront, even when we don't acknowledge it, like the Arabic novel. We don't think of the Arabic novel as being invented by women, but Aisha Taimur in 1887 wrote, this long fictional narrative, which could be considered a precursor of the Arabic novel, if not an early Arabic novel. And then we also have Labiba Hashim in 1904 publishing a serialized novel called Qalb al-Rajul, The Heart of Man. So women were sort of at the forefront of creating the Arabic novel. And then they were also, and this is, I think, why Fadwa Tuqan and especially Nazik al-Malaika and Salma Jayusi were so important, because they were at the forefront of Ash-Sha'r al-Hur. So the it translates literally as free verse, but it's actually foot-based meter. Also women of the Nahda, people like Mai Ziyada especially, she's a beautiful stylist. So when I think of Mai Ziyada, I don't necessarily think of forms and genres, although she did write a lot of beautiful letters. But I just think of her writing style and how it really, I think it was very influential, and it sort of liberated prose genres and prose fiction. And she and her colleagues were associated with something called the narrative essay, which is sometimes considered a prototype of the short story. So I kind of wanted to say, on the one hand, that women aren't necessarily pigeonholed, and they're not, I mean, that isn't, there may be genres that women are associated with, obviously. But I wanted to make the point that that they're associated with a lot of genres, and they're also often associated with innovation and, you know, and sort of introducing new genres and forms.
Thank you. So we have a lot of questions. I just wanted to, and go ahead and keep putting them in there. But I just wanted to turn to Sawad for one last thing before we go to the audience questions. And I think if you look at, and I wasn't personally paying attention at the time, but if you look at the women's writing that was being translated from Arabic to English in the 80s and 90s, it was very sort of ethnographic focused. The writing of Noella Sadewi was translated because she spoke about FGM. And this sort of ethnographic interest has been sort of very dominant theme in all of translation into English, but all very particularly about women and their writing. And I wondered if you saw that changing because of Johal Harawi and Adania Shibli being recognized by the Booker International, or for any other reason, that are publishers becoming more interested in women as stylists than they used to be for the content of, you know, whether their feminism was good or whether they were what they were revealing?
So unfortunately, my answer is yes and no. I don't know. Do you want the good news or the bad news first?
The good news.
Okay, good news. Great. Okay, so I mean, Rania Abdurrahman is on this, you know, chat, and I won't give the name of the publisher, but we're currently signing a contract for Buthaina Al-Aisa's latest book, which is Haris Satah Al-Alam, which is Guardian of Superficialities, which could be set anywhere in the Arab world. It's not like she's a Kuwaiti author, you know, powerhouse, but the book, you can't tell it's set in the Arab world. It's about a book censor and how he gradually becomes like in love with books at the risk of, you know, to his life, which obviously, if you're aware of the situation in Kuwait, you know that this is what she's alluding to. But what the publisher actually liked about it, they said, is that you don't know where it's set. It could be set in Latin America. It could be set, you know, in Europe. But people love to read books about books. And so it's a gripping story. And so that was really encouraging for me when I pitched it. And we're very excited, you know, hopefully, you know, once the contract is signed and all, then we can announce the news, etc. But that they weren't looking specifically for, you know, like a story about Kuwait. But having said that, for example, like Stella Gaetano's work, you know, originally when I was pitching it, I started with Daedalus, which is a smaller publishing house. But since it has been signed, so many other people have gotten in touch with me. And Stella's book is like a multi-generation, you know what it is. I mean, you love her work, but for the sake of the audience, like a multi-generational epic about 3 generations, like of women, you know, which is detailing the civil war in Sudan, but also like culture, his history. It's very rich, right? But on its own, it stands as a piece of literature, right? Which makes it great. But for an editor, they loved it because it isn't this ethnographic, you know, sort of foray into Sudan. But I had a lot of other people contacting me, like, you know, some literary agents and some other editors being like, oh, do you have anything else like that? Like just about some other country in the Arab world, which is just like, you know, like just like Stella's work. And I'm like, no, I don't. Like, you know, like I don't have something like that off the, you know, top of my head. And like another example is Najwa bin Shatwan's latest book, Roma Termini, is about a migrant from Ukraine living in Italy, right? It has nothing to do with the Arab world. In one of her interviews, somebody asked, well, like, why didn't you write about an Arab immigrant? Like, that's your experience, right? Wouldn't you have been more better placed to write about something like that? And she's like, why should I have to write about something like that? Like, this is what I want to write about, right? And she spoke about the inspiration for the work. But you know, I've been talking to a few editors about that work versus her other book, which is called Wabar al-Ahsina, The Horse's Hair, which is like a retelling of the creation story based in 1960s Libya with a feminist like kick to it. And I love it. It's a great book, but editors are responding more to The Horse's Hair because it's set in Libya, right? And it's including the culture and the history, as opposed to Roma Termini, which again is a great piece of literature, but they're like, it's not Arab enough. So unfortunately, I would say like the needles move like a little bit, but it needs to still move a lot more. So yeah. Okay,
so I'm going to start with the questions, and I'm just going to start with Lindsay's question since she was the first to put her question in, so she wins. And she doesn't point it to a particular person, so anyone who feels they want to answer. She says, I'd be interested in your thoughts about what we might call a contemporary prestige economy, where the International Prize for Arabic Fiction, the Sheikh Zayed Book Award, the International Booker, etc., filter what gets translated from Arabic into English, constructing a new sort of canon. And I know Lindsay is writing about this. To what extent do these prizes influence when it's translated? Who has power relatively? The prize judges, the translators, the publishers who are trying to anticipate audiences. And she says, I realize there's no single answer to this. If nobody's going to answer immediately,
I have actually something to say. Yes, I think it's a very important question to ask about the economy of literature at the moment. But I just want to point out that it's not just the Arabs and their awards who filter what to be translated. This is not right at all. We have long history of being a subject of selectivity from the others. And we have so many questions about this selectivity. I mean, like Arab female writers, as Sawad just said, there is a particular expectation from here, for example. All of the waves of translation connected to political wars and displacement, all the time translation is tied with political question. So actually, what's happening in Arab world since getting all of these awards, and usually based on Gulf states, as we know, is encouraging translation to minor languages, actually, because what I see from my research, my own research, is most of the writers awarded, like, for example, the Booker, or you will find some of their work already translated into languages, other languages, but they get the opportunity to be translated to some languages that usually don't translate from Arabic, like, for example, Slovenian, Azerbaijani language, and this is actually in itself great. And I'll give example of myself. Basically, Sheikh Zayed book, we had like 8 contracts for the book before I got the award or anything, and of course my other work is translated. So we have awards already, but actually I will be very excited if, because of the award, this book is translated to Azerbaijani, for example. I would be very happy. So reaching out to some other culture with no big economy or money to translate from Arabic culture is a good thing, and we should appreciate it. But this is not a filter, because even translation doesn't make any writer important unless he really has a reason to be read again and again.
Sawad, was there anything you wanted to say about the literary prizes and the filtering to canon?
Yeah, so I think, unfortunately, I don't think it's, I mean, the literary prizes do have sway, because when I'm pitching a work, an editor is like, well, how did this do in the original language, right? But if it wasn't lauded by critics, at least I can say, oh, it was on a bestseller list. Like, you know, Buthana's book, right? Guardian of the Superficialities, it wasn't on any like long list or short list, but it was one of the best-selling books in, I think, like 2020. So that's something I can give them. But I want to say translators themselves have so much agency, right? I have a real intention about the works that I'm choosing, and I'm kind of curating. It's a bit scary, but I'm curating the canon here, that what's coming into English, right? Which is kind of like cool because it's the books that I like, but also it's like, why do I have this power? Because, you know, there's not like a infrastructure of agenting with Arab language, unfortunately. I mean, there are a few agents working, but it's not as strong as Swedish or Korean. So it's really upon the translators to choose what resonates with them. And then I'm the one who's pitching this work, right? And so the power, I think, lies more so than people realize with translators, but also with acquiring editors in the publishing houses, which unfortunately don't have a lot of trust in translators because they can't read the Arabic, right? With the exception of a few houses like Seagull Books, who have their Hussam Abu Aila, who is their external Arab list editor, and Darf, who can actually read a manuscript in Arabic. Other publishing houses are solely depending on me and an external reader to make the decision for them, right? So it's really scary for them, understandably, because they're putting a lot of money into it. But at the same time, that kind of like bottlenecks what's getting through. So I think what really also needs to change is the people working in these publishing houses. I'm not saying everyone needs to learn Arabic, but at least have like a stronger network of people so you can build up this trust, right? So it doesn't take me 6 years for you to believe me that this book is good. Because a lot of people are now like, oh, you have so many books coming out, like you have so much work. It's like, I've been doing this since 2008, okay? Only in the past 5 years have people started listening to me. It shouldn't take that long. But yeah, okay, I'm done. I know we have a lot of questions.
Yeah, and I think translators also what they think that the publishing houses will want. That's also a factor. So I think this was Sophia. Yes, it was Sophia Brown as saying, following on Marcia's question about the ethnographic lens that unfortunately still gets used by Anglophone publishers / reviewers. Do the other panelists feel that this affects women's writing more than men? And if so, why? Or perhaps different lenses are applied to each. Iman.
First, I want to appreciate Sawad talk about individual translators who have, their own, relation with literature in general, and they can translate good books from Arabic. And we all see that there is really a big change in the kind of books from Arabic into English or French these days. Some really experimental or marginalized writers are visible through translation. For ethnography, I mean, because I did some academic work on what I call the emergency of translation. When an institution, a university, or even a translator is interested to know about, ISIS and, Yazidi women. I mean, so they will look for every single book written about the topic and translate it. I'm not even against this kind of translation at all. Actually, I encourage personally different types of translations. The problem happens when this is an emergency books are considered the Arabic literature. It's not true. So the diversity is really the solution to this. Is just to, if you want to represent a culture, this culture has diversity. It doesn't work all the time under the gun of wars and rape and female circumcision and so on and so forth. That's all. That's all I want to say. There is improvement for sure. There are so many individual young, even young and old translators who are having, their own project and a test to bring Arabic text to their languages.
So sorry for Iman again. To what extent does what gets translated change the canon? So for instance, Samah Salim's translation of Arwasala seemed to have a sort of a knock-on effect of bringing Arwasala's work back into discussion in Arabic because of Samah Salim's translation into English. So to what extent does that change?
This is a really interesting question. I don't think Samah Salim translation brought Arwasala to the canon. Arwasala was called from the tome after 2011 Arab Spring, basically. All of us know this. I have been in Facebook, for example. It was rare to see young writers or young readers, to be right, citing or writing sentences from Arwa Saleh book or asking about her. After the Arab Spring, lots of changes happened in Arab culture, and unfortunately, we don't pay attention to them. And I think really about myself, even as a marginalized poet until maybe 2015 or so. I mean, like, it's like elite poetry book read by, people who like this kind of poetry. So things changed a lot. Lots of writers became, more read after the Arab Spring. Why and how we need to study it. So Samah Salim translation is actually adding to what I'm saying, diversity of Arab literature. We don't have just Alifa Rifat and Nawal Saadawi and Fatma al-Marnisi. We don't have only women tackling or interested in, feminist questions. We have also fragile soul who was involved in politics and who failed because of what? She is not a victim, of course. We can think about her. We can relate to her because in every culture we have more than one Arwa Saleh. So this what Samah Salim book did. It didn't bring her to Arab culture. It brought her to English readers more, and the classroom, of course.
So we have only 1 minute or so left, I think, before I think we'll just be suddenly disappear from you. So Marley, if there's one writer, woman writer or book that you would like to see translated or come to a greater attention internationally, what is that?
Well, you mean like a pre-modern female author?
Yeah.
Well, I hope that I'll be involved in publishing an edition of Al-Khansat's Diwan, which will be translated into English. And I think it's important. We don't have proper translations of Al-Khansat, even though she is so canonical. I think in English, there's Arthur Wormhout's translation, which has no critical apparatus. And then James Montgomery has a lovely pamphlet that he published with translations of a lot of her poems. But hopefully we'll get something more complete out there. But I don't know, that's under review.
Okay. What about you, Sawad? What have you pitched that's still out there from all these things that you've been pitching since 2008 that nobody's been listening to you about?
Oh, well, I was actually going to say, like, just really blanket statement because there's like no time left. I want more nonfiction in English by, Arab women authors, and by Arab, I mean like writing in Arabic. So it can be from the African continent as well. Specifically, Maha Hassan's Fi Beit Anne Frank that Adi Leak has pitched, and you can see the video on the Arab Lit channel from the Bila Hudud Festival. You need to pick that up like fast. That's my last thing.
Okay, well, yes, because there's a publisher who already expressed interest, so don't be late.
Yes.
All right. Well, then my understanding is that we will suddenly be shut off. Thank everybody.
Thank you so much, Marcia.
Time today. Thank you, Marley. Thank you, Iman.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Marley.
For your time. And thank you to everyone who came to this panel.
Yes.
And who is now typing in their own thanks. We hope.
All right. Bye-bye.
Yalla, bye.